If you know about security tokens, you've probably heard that 24/7 trading is now possible, but it wasn't in the past. Not true. You've probably heard that fractionalisation is amazing and it's brand new. Also, not true. There are so many misconceptions around what security tokens are that it's kind of insane. First up, the disclaimer. Nothing in this video is intended as financial advice. Please pause the video now and read the disclaimer in full. In this video, I'll be interviewing Marc, a lawyer from the firm Fisher Broyles. He's been dealing with the many misconceptions surrounding security tokens for some time, and I've seen him write some great articles on the topic, so I invited him on the channel so we can break down exactly what these myths are. There's also going to be time jumps in the description, so if you'd like to skip ahead at any point to one particular misconception, feel free to open up that description now and jump ahead. Without any further ado, let's begin with the interview. I'm joined today by Marc from Fisher Broyles. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Perfect. So we're going to be talking in this video particularly about many of the misconceptions in security tokens. I speak to a lot of people and I think that 95% of what they think about security tokens isn't necessarily correct, but the 5% remaining is very, very powerful. But it's important to bust through that 95% so we can actually understand what this is and what it isn't. So we're going to be covering a lot of that in this video. But firstly, do you want to just introduce yourself to the audience and explain a bit of your background?
Sure. So my name is Marc Boiron. I'm a partner at Fisher Broyles in the fintech and blockchain practice. I got interested in blockchain in 2015, and then beginning of 2017, I said I love the tech. So why don't I just move my legal practice over there? So since then, all I've been doing is really practicing in this space. So I've got clients that, kind of broad range with the security token offerings, other token sales, token distributions, airdrops, crypto exchanges, security token exchanges, crypto funds, a little bit kind of everything. But yeah, just kind of just love the tech. And so kind of being able to spend time with people smarter than me who get to explain the tech. And I get to start learning about it. It's pretty cool. And it's funny when you touched on kind of the misconceptions of security tokens. I have to see that one of the things that is the most frustrating about it is that it actually takes away from the security tokens, right? Right? Because if you talk about all these things it can do, and the whole world's talking about all these things it can do, everyone else who's like not in the security token world or crypto is like, yeah, we already do these things. How is this new? And it suddenly just looks like another hoax because they think crypto's a hoax in the first place. So yeah, that part's been super frustrating, actually.
I completely agree. That's one of the common things that I hear when I speak to people in traditional finance. It's always the same rhetoric of, we can already do this. And a lot of it is kind of true. But it's simplifying the process and it's taking out many of the layers. Sure. And when you start improving on the costs, something that was possible that you never really did in the past then becomes feasible and you gain all these advantages. So let's get specific and jump in with the first one, which is 24/7 trading. So I think a lot of people think that's brand new. We couldn't do that in the past, but it couldn't be further from the truth. So do you want to break that one down?
Yeah, I mean, and it's easiest to talk about it in context of private securities, right? So nothing traded on a stock exchange or anything like that. In that context, you've basically think of it as like a company sells stock to a person, and that person's holding that stock. That person then says, hey, I want to go sell it to somebody else. So what they're going to do is they're going to sign a stock certificate on the back, and they're going to sign some kind of transfer agreement, whatever jurisdiction, however they're going to name it. And they're going to go meet with that person or just communicate by email, send documents, and I don't care what time it is. I don't care if it's midnight. I don't care if it's 1 a.m. They can send them BTC back right now, or they can go hand them a pile of cash. Bottom line is you can do 24/7 trading right now. It's just not efficient, which we'll get into later, but it's doable.
Yeah, that's spot on. And another interesting thing, even if you go to the public markets, so this is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you think of 24/7 trading, firstly, it's perfectly possible to have the IT infrastructure today where in 2019, it's not that advanced to have something running 24 hours a day. And you could hire people because we're talking about financial institutions. There's a lot of money. It's not that expensive to hire someone to run things 24/7. The reason that they tend to limit the hours is to group liquidity together. Because if you have tons of buyers and sellers, but it's spread over 24 hours, that's not a very liquid market. Group it into 8 or 9 hours. Suddenly you have this grouped liquidity. So it's always been possible. But what is it particularly that security tokens could do to open that up? So if we're pushing liquidity, we're pushing those hours to a specific time to group liquidity. What is it that security tokens do which lift that away so we don't need to group liquidity?
You know, that's an interesting question, as in, do we need to still group liquidity or do we not? Right now, I think there's actually proposals out there. Some people that talk to in the community that say we should just trade security tokens once a month. Which seems like it defeats the purpose. But the reason is because we have no liquidity whatsoever right now in the security token market. And I think it's to be seen whether you can have sufficient liquidity in a more elongated period of time. I think the difference right now, and regulations need to change, and for a lot of this, frankly, regulations need to change at least somewhat, but is when you're going to have truly global markets. Because right now, you know, it's you know, how often U.S. people go buy stock on a non-U.S. exchange? I mean, it's tiny. And so once that changes and you can now have a global market, presumably you're going to have a lot more liquidity in every security, and there'll be enough buyers so that you can open that market up to the world 24/7 and still have liquidity. I don't know that that's actually truly the answer, but presumably that's the case. I mean, if you've got, you know, another 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion people who can suddenly participate in the market at hours when you're sleeping, seems like it's a viable option.
Yeah, this is exactly what my research has been pointing at. It's that we could do it right now, but it's a terrible idea to do it. But if you have people across the globe that are awake and trading, and they are connected to the same sort of exchanges we're using worldwide, you don't need to restrict these hours to group liquidity. You just take away that barrier and you can have liquidity 24/7 because we have this potential global pool of liquidity. It's very interesting point. And it's a misconception that people think that security tokens have now made this possible when it wasn't possible in the past. Not true in the slightest. The next one is fractionalization. So that's another key selling point. Everyone says with security tokens, you can create a fraction of, you can fractionalize ownership of something, create just a very small percentage and just sell that to someone. It's much cheaper. It's much more efficient. Fractionalization has existed in the past. So what is it that's different about security tokens, which take it from not a great system that people didn't do much, to something that's interesting and people might do in the future? Yeah.
I mean, it really comes down to how you created fractional ownerships in the past and how you transfer those fractional ownerships. So, right, you take real estate. That's an easy example. You can purchase a property in multiple people's names, or put that property, the way we do right now with security tokens, into an entity and create, you know, and fractionalize those interests. You can even take that stock in that entity and sell half of one share to somebody, at least in the private markets. Public markets won't allow you to do it. And so you could always do this. The problem was when you want to sell a piece of real estate, a fractional interest in a piece of real estate, going to find a buyer for that fractional interest and then actually drafting the documents to transfer that fractional interest is just time consuming and expensive. I don't know how much the security token market is going to address a small interest in a real estate property. Like it seems like there might still be issues there.
Yeah.
But if you find a buyer, actually being able to effect that transfer will be much more efficient than needing to draft a bunch of documents from scratch.
So it's essentially how technology changes everything. It's automation, which takes away slow, manual, expensive processes and just makes them much more faster, cheaper, and efficient. So you could do it in the past, but you didn't want to do it because it was terrible. So you can do it in a much better way.
Yeah, you know, it's something that maybe we'll touch on it later, but just at a high level, part of the benefit of security tokens is this idea that you're spreading costs that right now we incur one by one across the entire market. So what I mean by that is right now, if somebody wants to sell a fractional piece of real estate, he's going to go ahead and he or she's going to hire a lawyer, the seller's going to hire a lawyer, the buyer's going to hire a lawyer, and they're going to transact. And if they're in different jurisdictions, then you're going to have lawyers in different jurisdictions. And then the next person who wants to sell that same fractional interest is going to do the same thing because he had no relationship with that buyer and there's no kind of compliance across that security. And so what this is essentially doing is saying, hey, we're going to build these compliance protocols, and some companies are going to spend a bunch of money, and hopefully they'll actually really follow through and finish with it. But they'll spend a bunch of money to build compliance. And now everyone else is going to pay a portion of that every time they want to issue a security or transfer security, instead of actually having to pay the entire cost every single time. And so that makes kind of fractional ownership a lot more realistic, not just in terms of the creation, but in terms of the transfer of it.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's quite interesting you mention whether there's going to be that much demand for something like a small piece of real estate, just one individual piece of real estate. I kind of, to some extent, think fractionalization itself is a misconception, because like the idea that there's some Chinese buyer that wants to buy a small, tiny portion of an apartment in Manhattan. He's never gone to that apartment. He's never seen it. He has no way of evaluating it. It seems like it would be a better option to buy something like a REIT, which is, or maybe an improved version of a REIT, which you can have through security tokens, which is essentially a bundle of diversified real estate investments into, and maybe you can pick an area. So I almost think of fractionalization as something which is really pushed as a huge, huge selling point. I think there are some instances where it's quite powerful, but I also think there's many that I hear which I don't know whether that will ever take off. I can't see a liquid market ever forming for some random person's apartment in Manhattan.
Yeah, on the residential side, I certainly agree with you. On the commercial side, I think there might be room for that, because it might very well be those REITs themselves who are going to own some fractional interest of the property. Because you're right. I mean, somebody in China's, why would they buy 1% of some random property here? But a REIT who can do diligence on it, and very well could. But that also gets to a point that's like very high on my priority list, which is information. And we need, for this market to work, we essentially need to build the same type of infrastructure as you've got in the public markets when it comes to disclosure. And when it comes to research reports, all of that. It's not going to be as robust, but you need to get pretty close. And so in the real estate context, you would hope that at one point you've got landlords who tokenize their property, and they decide that they're going to post all the leases, and that they're going to actually have some way to automate how much is being paid and how much gets paid out, and being able to actually visibly see what is coming in and what is going out. Once you can get more of those disclosures, I think, and information on chain, I think there's going to be a lot of value there. And then buying fractional interest in things might be more viable than we think it is now.
That's actually such an interesting point. I don't hear many people talking about. It's the lack of information in private markets. Because public markets are so efficient, everything is generally priced. You could argue it's as it should be, or certainly it's very difficult to get an edge, because nobody knows if it's wrong, how wrong it is. It's very difficult to find that edge. In private markets, you didn't really have to worry about it that much, because there was such low liquidity. There wasn't many people trading it. If we're going to introduce liquidity to private markets, we need information in there. Otherwise, we're going to have horrendous pricing errors. Exactly. And the market is going to be terrible.
Yep. And then frankly, nobody's going to buy it. I mean, I go right now on Open Finance, and I'll buy, BCAP for fun. But I wouldn't buy it as an investment, because frankly, I don't even know what I'm buying, because there's no information out there, and nobody else could really buy it with any true purpose, because they don't understand what's behind it. So until that starts getting disclosed, it's, I think we're going to continue to see a few trades here or there, and I think most of that's people testing it out.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I think we're in the very early days. This is very interesting, and it's when you understand it, you understand the impact of it, but it's easy to get involved in the industry and just think that this is taking over and forget how incredibly early we really are.
Yeah.
So we talked about private market trading. That's another interesting one. I think a lot of people believe that before security tokens, private market trading was completely impossible. It never happened. And yet there are companies like SharesPost, which facilitate pre-IPO trading. They carry out private trading every single day. So it's not a particularly liquid market at the moment, though. What exactly changes so that a market which does already exist becomes more liquid?
Yeah, I think it ends up being a few things. So the first thing is when you've got compliance built in to the smart contracts, then it becomes so much easier to actually affect those transfers. Somebody wants to actually purchase it, you can affect that trade immediately after the smart contract verifies that trade is permissible. I think that's probably the biggest thing that kind of makes a huge difference. Because right now, if you want to buy it, it's an entire process, and frankly, still a lot of paperwork. The second thing is going to be, it's not that it wasn't possible; it's that it wasn't done. And what I mean by that is one of the things that really kind of crypto started. I was backing up for a second. When you talk about ICOs, people, especially in the security token space, talk about them, negatively. My view is that they pushed the limits so far, and frankly went way past the limits, but that it forced regulators to rethink things. And frankly, it forced everybody to rethink things. And security tokens are continuing, I think, to do that. And so, what you've got is things like considerations of changing credit investor rules, things like that. Things like how you were going to make secondary trading more permissible in the private markets. All that's being talked about, and it never was before. And so I think one of the things that's happened is, for example, you've got T0 that expects to launch a national securities exchange in security tokens next year. That is something that was brought about, that you are now going to have a private market participant like T0 and then a public market participant like T0 only by kind of this market, something that frankly I don't think really would have happened otherwise. And so I think a lot of it is really simply the fact that we're willing to develop this market further than we were before, because we actually think there can be liquidity in this market, whereas we really never believed there could be much liquidity in a market without this technology.
It's very interesting points. Another thing I tend to think as well is competition between companies. So companies often place trading restrictions on their shares in private markets. And as you say, if you can bake the compliance in, you can take away some of those for trading restrictions, because they don't have to worry about breaking the law, because they literally can't. You try and send a transaction, it will just get an error message. But also, if your competitor is providing liquidity to his investors, it looks like a more attractive investment. And also, there's the liquidity premium they might gain from that. So I kind of think companies are going to be forced into doing it because the competition does it and they gain an advantage. And the way that most technology takes over in life isn't that everyone decides we need to adopt this. It's someone else does it first. They gain something, and then you're playing catch up and you start doing the same thing.
Yeah, I think so there's so many different markets here that we talk about in security tokens that it's hard to almost distinguish, right? So you've got like the debt markets, where I think this is a no-brainer and it should take off without any issue, although it'll still be issues, but it should take off. It won't be a problem. Our real estate market, same thing, bigger commercial properties, this seems to make sense. But then there's other areas where, it's a little more questionable, so early stage companies. So one of the issues there, for example, is when you've got VCs investing in them, most agreements that are being entered into right now will still have prohibitions on issuing any kind of token, crypto, security token, doesn't matter what, without that VC's approval. And so if you need to go get the consent of a, let's call it incumbent, to actually do that, are they really going to want to do it when they're used to holding on to that stock for long periods of time? Now, once in a while it's going to happen, but I think most of the time they're going to think that they're used to building companies and helping build companies and being investors in companies where you don't have that liquid market. And all those things they don't understand, and frankly, we don't even know how it's going to play out in terms of liquidity in an early stage company, is things that freak them out, and they're never going to be okay with it unless they're the ones who actually want that liquidity. In which case, frankly, they could probably find a private buyer anyway.
Yeah, and I think you've actually kind of touched on a misconception as well there. It's early stage companies. A lot of people I speak to also think that we need to give liquidity to early stage companies. And when I talk about private markets, I more mean past that point, because I don't see why a company worth $5 million needs to have a daily trading volume. If you're an early company, that's a negative thing. You don't really want liquidity. You want to build your product and build your company to a point where then you can then build in liquidity at a future time. This whole concept of instant liquidity, not a good thing.
And how do you have liquidity in a $2 million float? I mean, it's just never going to happen. Then when you think about it, you're like, okay, now I want to go raise a round of financing. And right now, I think that I should be able to sell this stock at $5 a share, and it's trading at $4 a share. Why don't your investors potential investors go buy it at $4 a share? That's an issue. Now, there's probably ways to deal with that, and there's rights that they would potentially get, things like that you could get. Bottom line is, it's messy, and just there's so much better markets to go after than that one.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's interesting for the companies that are sort of in between. If you're large in a private market but not quite big enough for a public market, you sort of hit that middle ground. That's where I think you can introduce liquidity, and it's a real bonus. Everything before that, I don't see there's much point. There's not much of a benefit. I think there's more of a loss, if anything.
Yeah. Well, and then on this subject, I mean, the one thing that people don't talk about enough is, people like to talk about security token offerings. I actually think that word, frankly, totally overused. And the more important thing is really tokenizing existing securities.
Yes.
And so, to me, the biggest market for this is just taking public securities, cutting out the middleman, and putting it on a blockchain. That's, to me, like probably the biggest opportunity. Maybe private debt might be bigger, but other than that, it's just a no-brainer.
I completely agree. I've been saying this one constantly. It's that security token offerings are just a very small, narrow portion of the total market size, because everything that's already come is significantly bigger than the things just coming through now. So what's the bigger market potential?
Yeah.
You keep on mentioning debt, actually. So I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. Why do you think debt is such an interesting one?
Because of the ease. And so just very simply that you go ahead and you issue the debt. The debt holders now have a right to a certain amount of income. It is very easy to distribute, through a stable coin or otherwise, that income in a very automated way. So now you don't have to deal with, monthly payments that are just a pain, sometimes in very small amounts that frankly hardly make it worth it. And this is the same thing with dividend distributions. So I think that's one part of it. Then you've just got the transparency, which, if I am and I wouldn't do it now, but very soon enough, if I'm representing an investor, I would basically say, hey, I want you to set aside in a stablecoin into this wallet, and I want to know that wallet address and look. Essentially, amounts that show me that you actually have the cash to repay this. And if you need to pay back, $5 a month, or let's go $30 a month, then I want to see $1 in there every day. And if you don't see $1 in there one day, as an investor, you're going to call and you're going to say, hey, why didn't the dollar show up there? What it's going to do is give, debt holders the ability to see the issuer's ability to repay that debt a whole lot sooner. And so I think it's an easy market to do that. There's also fewer restrictions. So like 12G, for example, in the equity markets in the US, which essentially says that once you have $10 million of assets and more than 2,000 total equity holders or 500 unaccredited ones, then you need to go ahead and register to essentially be a public reporting company. That doesn't exist in the debt markets, for example. And there's a whole lot of things, even under Reg S, which is international sales in the US. There's a whole lot more flexibility as a debt security than as an equity security. So I just think that because of all of that put together, the natural kind of use of the blockchain as well as regulations, it's kind of a perfect fit.
I completely agree. I think debt is one of the most interesting things to tokenize. What's funny is coming from when you speak to people in the crypto world, there's quite a low interest unless they come from the traditional sector as well, because it's boring, to be honest with you. Crypto investors like 1,000 times returns, and you say
in a way that's true, but then look at the entire DeFi world right now, right? I mean, there's a lot of it. I mean, let's take a look at DAI and Maker. I mean, it's basically a glorified loan product. I don't know that it's glorified actually, but it's fantastic. But that's essentially what it is, and it works so well because everything is on chain. One day, I think we'll be able to have, and I think that's another part of it, is it's easier to issue an entire debt security on chain than an equity security or a piece of real estate.
And hey, at the end of the day, boring is good. Boring means we know what we're getting, and when there's such a large market size, boring is what we want. So as a lawyer, I'm sure that you get constantly frustrated with the regulations. I'm sure it's a constant pushing point for you. So I'm interested to hear if you think that there are current regulations holding back the market development for security tokens. Because on a high level, you just follow the security token laws. It's very simple. If anything, in blockchain, it's one of the most clear paths. But there are some interesting things in America, like there's the topic of the qualified custodian. People aren't quite sure what counts the qualified custodian. So are there any particular things which you think are holding back the current development of the market in terms of the regulatory side?
Yeah, I think it's and this is there's no way this was going to happen fast. Well, let me step back by saying the first thing that needs to happen is that mainstream needs to trust the technology, right? It's actually that's the threshold issue. And if you think about it, it's actually the right answer. I mean, to think that we would move the entire public markets onto a technology that more or less is 10 years old, and maybe a little more arguably, it's a little bit crazy in a way. As much as I trust the technology, that's probably not intelligent of me to actually think that would be a good idea. So let's just assume that we move to, we need to first get to a world where that technology is actually trusted by mainstream, which, the regulators are mainstream. They're not crypto, with very few exceptions. And so once we get to that point, then we can have the conversation of, hey, here's all these intermediaries that are just unnecessary. To me, the one that's the biggest is the transfer agent. It's let's get rid of transfer agents.
Yep.
And people say, well, they provide all these other ancillary services. Well, they would be replaced if we wanted right now by security token issuance platforms that are building better technology to do the same thing. Then you've got, I don't know, let's take clearing, post-settlement clearing of trades. Again, it's one of those things that's kind of well, no, they're going to settle when you actually pay for it on chain. You don't have any concerns. So those are two big ones. The qualified custodian is one that is hard because in the US, funds, most of them are going to be required to have a qualified custodian. Traditionally, it has made sense. And frankly, even with security tokens, it could make sense. Here's where it doesn't make sense. If you build a protocol properly, or a layer 2 solution, so that if you lose a security token, it's reissued, which is the way everybody does it now. The custodian doesn't necessarily give you all that much protection. Now, it does give some independence that might help protect investors. But there's enough nuances there, I think the qualified custodians is actually one that's going to stick around longer than others, even though I'm not totally sure we need them in the context of security tokens that, investors can see them in the wallet. If they get lost, they get reissued. They're really, I don't think there's a need for them, but I understand it more. The things like transfer agents is still existing. That one bothers me. I'm we need to get rid of them.
You mentioned a few interesting points about the US, and yet there are other countries which are coming out and basically saying that they recognize the transfer of securities on a blockchain as being just essentially the same as any other way of transferring securities. What are your thoughts on other countries then? Is there, so like some of those issues, you're saying, for example, trusting the blockchain in the first place. You're almost thinking that that's quite forward thinking, that they are already trusting the blockchain. Because when you put it like that, it is quite a huge leap when you think of it.
Yeah. I think the biggest issue for now is that most jurisdictions that fall in that more favorable category are emerging markets. And so, there's not much that's going to
France come out and say, I believe there's French regulations in there that has basically done the same thing, which is quite a forward step for quite a large economy.
So being French, I shouldn't say this, but in that world, I would almost call them an emerging country. No, I'm kidding. No, you're right. I mean, I did see that was very recent about France. No, look, and it's going to happen more and more. There's no doubt about it. I also think that regulations are lighter in most jurisdictions outside the U.S. So there is no doubt that I could see security tokens flourishing outside of the U.S. before they do in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the caveat. What you see from other jurisdictions already now, the security token offerings that are coming from them, they're a lot less, let's call it, disciplined than what you see in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, U.S. offerings from here, most of them, they're actually, they're being super careful.
Mm-hmm.
You see some of the non-U.S. offerings, and I won't name companies, that they're offering them kind of willy-nilly. They're doing it, but they're kind of like, let's kind of ignore the regulations. So in a way, that's good because it gives us the opportunity to test the technology, push it forward.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, it has the opportunity to just hurt the markets in the long run with investors who get crappy products and ultimately technology that maybe doesn't work. So bottom line, I think it's actually going to proliferate outside of the U.S. quicker than in the U.S. But I think it's going to ultimately be something where we get a lot of disappointment from a lot of those offerings.
Do you think that could ultimately hurt the US in a way? Because I know that the way the US regulation is the strictest in the world because you want the most regulated market, so people want to go there because there's that extra security. But if you have people going outside because there's more potential, do you think it plays back into that still, and then a lot of the innovation moves back to the US long term, or do you think it's more potentially damaging?
It's actually an interesting question. And I think besides China, US is by far the biggest, actually even including China, but by far the biggest market for anybody who wants to sell securities.
Yeah.
So essentially it drags everybody into compliance with US laws,
Mm-hmm.
Which sucks because you wish the US would move a little faster. But ultimately, any conversation I have with my non-US clients, almost every single one says, I want to sell into the US.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of buyers in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, I'm not sure it's going to happen. Now, the exception to that could be if China were to not have an even worse view than the US on security tokens,
Mm-hmm.
which, well, apparently they have that view. I mean, I think that's just one person spoken about it publicly in China and essentially treated it as if it's crypto in the most traditional sense. But, you've got a pretty big market in China over there. And so maybe you'd have issuers that would be satisfied with that market instead of coming into the US. But again, I think, from what I'm seeing, people still want to come to the US, even if they have to deal with the issues that you have to deal with here.
And if there's one thing you could change about regulation, and I know you're a lawyer, so I'm going to limit you to just one thing. I'm sure there's more than
about 10 of them.
Sure. What's the thing about US regulation you could change if you could?
Yeah. Trying to think of the best one here.
You can start listing them off if you like.
I think because it really goes to the core of what the technology does and how much it inhibits the technology. I am going to name two of them. And one of them is just the laws that actually require certain of these intermediaries, for example, transfer agents in certain cases.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just such a no-brainer where the technology fits so perfectly. And then the second one is just changes to make, not only make secondary markets for private securities more doable, really, but also to clarify it. Because right now, there's a lot of clarity on actually issuing security tokens, because we've issued securities forever, and that's all they are. But trading private securities is something we've never really done in bulk in the U.S. Again, there's companies that do it, but not in large amounts. So we need some more clarity and probably some changes on the secondary trading of private securities.
Very good answer. The final thing I tend to just ask guests, if you could leave the audience with some type of message. It could be about crypto, security tokens, your law firm, or just life in general. You can say whatever you like. What would you like to leave the audience with?
Let's all trust in the technology and build a security token market that is just like the public market. So issuers, let's go ahead and let's voluntarily provide information. Technology builders, let's look at how we can get the information and the actual security to flow more efficiently. And if we do that, then we're going to get to a point where, based on essentially that technology as well as that effort, nothing's really going to be able to hold the security token market back. Not from revolutionizing the current industry, but from an evolution that is still massive.
That is a fantastic message, and something that isn't touched on enough. Information is so important, and we can't have a liquid market when information is being restricted like it was in a previously illiquid market. Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Marc. I really appreciate this.
Thanks a bunch for having me. It's fun.